What would you do if you woke up knowing exactly how you were going to die tomorrow? That's the question Colonel Marcus Webb faced every morning at Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Iraq, where newspapers from the future appeared with yesterday's date, telling stories that hadn't happened yet. But when Webb opened the morning paper and saw his own obituary dated for the following day, he realized he had less than 24 hours to change a future that seemed already written in ink. It started on March 15, 2004, when Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez found the first newspaper outside the base mess hall. Rodriguez, a 28-year-old communications specialist from San Antonio with short black hair and tired brown eyes, had been pulling night duty when he discovered a copy of Stars and Stripes dated March 16th, sitting on a bench where no newspaper should have been. "Sir, we might have a problem," Rodriguez reported to Colonel Webb during the morning briefing. Webb, a 42-year-old career officer with graying temples and the weathered face of someone who'd spent 2 decades in combat zones, examined the newspaper with growing confusion. The newspaper looked authentic in every detail: proper formatting, correct military terminology, even the right printing quality. But it contained stories about events that were scheduled to happen later that day, including detailed reports of a Taliban attack on a convoy that wasn't supposed to leave base for another 6 hours. "Rodriguez, where exactly did you find this?" Webb asked, studying the impossible publication. Rodriguez pointed toward the mess hall entrance. "Right there on the bench, sir." Nobody was around, and I was watching that area all night. The newspaper just appeared sometime between 0500 and 0530 hours. Webb's first instinct was to dismiss the newspaper as some kind of elaborate prank, but the level of detail in the articles suggested access to classified information that no practical joker could possibly possess. The paper contained accurate troop movements, supply schedules, and operational details that were known only to senior command staff. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the base intelligence officer, was a 34-year-old analyst from Portland with shoulder-length brown hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. When Webb showed her the newspaper, Mitchell immediately began cross-referencing the information with current intelligence reports. "Colonel, this information is accurate as of this morning's briefing," Mitchell reported. "But some of these stories describe events that are supposed to happen 8 to 12 hours from now. There's no way this newspaper could have been printed and distributed using normal channels." Webb decided to test the newspaper's predictions by monitoring the convoy mentioned in the lead story. According to the article, Taliban insurgents attacked an American supply convoy en route Irish at 1430 hours, resulting in 3 wounded soldiers and the destruction of 2 Humvees. At exactly 1430 hours, radio communications erupted with reports from the convoy described in the newspaper. The attack occurred precisely as predicted. Same location, same casualties, same vehicle damage. The newspaper had somehow described future events with perfect accuracy. Lieutenant Jake Harrison, the convoy commander, was a 29-year-old infantry officer from Oregon with close-cropped blonde hair and the kind of steady demeanor that kept soldiers calm under fire. When he returned from the ambush, Harrison's report matched every detail in the mysterious newspaper. "The insurgents were positioned exactly where our intelligence predicted," Harrison reported during his debrief. "But their timing and tactics were more sophisticated than we expected. It was almost like they knew our route and schedule better than we did." Webb realized they were dealing with something far more complex than a security breach. The newspaper seemed to be providing genuine intelligence about future events, but the source and mechanism remained completely unexplained. The next morning, March 16th, another newspaper appeared in the same location. This edition was dated March 17th and contained stories about events that would supposedly occur during the following day. One headline immediately caught Webb's attention: Base commander killed in mortar attack during evening briefing. According to the article, Colonel Marcus Webb would be killed at 1900 hours during a routine staff meeting when insurgent mortars struck the command bunker. The story provided specific details about the attack, the number of rounds fired, the direction they came from, and even quoted Webb's final words before the explosion. Webb found himself in an impossible situation. If the newspaper was accurate, he had less than 18 hours to live. But if he changed his schedule to avoid the predicted attack, would that alter the timeline, or would fate find another way to fulfill the prophecy? Captain Mitchell analyzed the new newspaper with the same thoroughness she applied to all intelligence reports. Her findings were disturbing and scientifically impossible. "Colonel, this newspaper contains information that hasn't been generated yet," Mitchell reported. "The weather forecast matches predictions from our meteorological data, but extends 24 hours beyond our current projections. Unit movement orders described in the paper haven't been written yet, but they match operational plans that are still in development." Webb convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff to discuss the situation. The command team included Major David Chen, a 38-year-old operations officer from California with black hair and analytical skills that had earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. Captain Rodriguez, who had been promoted after discovering the first newspaper, and Chief Warrant Officer Mike Sullivan, a 45-year-old intelligence specialist from Boston whose 20-year career had prepared him for unusual situations. "Gentlemen, we're dealing with either the most sophisticated intelligence operation in military history or something that defies conventional understanding," Webb announced. "Either way, we need to determine how to use this information to protect our personnel." Major Chen suggested they could use the newspapers to prevent casualties by avoiding predicted attacks or altering operational plans. But Captain Mitchell raised concerns about the implications of changing future events. If these newspapers are somehow reporting actual future events, changing those events might create paradoxes or unintended consequences, Mitchell warned. "We might save lives in the short term while creating larger problems in the long term." Webb decided to test whether the future could be changed by implementing security measures designed to prevent his own predicted death. He moved the evening briefing to a different location, increased security around the command bunker, and ordered counter-battery fire on the positions from which the mortars were predicted to be launched. At 1900 hours, as Webb conducted the staff meeting in the relocated briefing room, explosions rocked the original command bunker exactly as the newspaper had predicted. Insurgent mortars struck the empty building with precision that suggested detailed intelligence about normal base operations. But Webb survived because he had moved the meeting. The newspaper's prediction had been accurate about the attack, but not about its ultimate success, suggesting that future events could be influenced by present actions. The third newspaper, dated March 18th, arrived the following morning with a disturbing new development. The headlines described successful American operations that hadn't been planned yet, including detailed accounts of raids on insurgent positions that command staff was still discussing in preliminary meetings. More troubling, the newspaper began including personal stories about individual soldiers, describing events from their past and future with intimate detail that suggested access to information far beyond military intelligence. One article described Sergeant Rodriguez's childhood in San Antonio, including details about family members that Rodriguez had never mentioned to anyone at the base. Rodriguez confronted Webb about the personal information appearing in the mysterious newspapers. "Colonel, somebody knows things about my family that I've never told anyone. My sister's wedding date, my father's medical condition, conversations I had with my mother last week. How is that information getting into these newspapers?" Webb realized they were dealing with something that transcended normal intelligence gathering. The newspapers seemed to have access to information about past, present, and future events affecting everyone on the base, suggesting surveillance capabilities that were either technologically impossible or completely outside normal human understanding. Captain Mitchell's analysis of the third newspaper revealed another disturbing pattern. "Colonel, the newspapers are becoming more detailed and more personal with each edition. It's like whatever is producing them is learning more about us and gaining access to information that should be impossible to obtain." The fourth newspaper arrived with Webb's photograph on the front page, showing him reading the previous day's newspaper. The accompanying story described his thoughts and emotions while dealing with the mysterious publications, quoting internal monologue that he had never spoken aloud to anyone. "How can they know what I was thinking?" Webb asked Mitchell during their private meeting. "I never wrote down those thoughts, never spoke them, never even discussed them with my wife in letters home." Mitchell had no explanation for how the newspapers could contain information about Webb's internal mental processes. "Colonel, we're dealing with something that has access to information that exists only inside your mind. That suggests surveillance technology or capabilities that are completely beyond anything in our intelligence databases." As the newspapers continued appearing, they began describing events further into the future. Stories dated weeks and months ahead that described the outcomes of battles not yet fought, the fates of soldiers not yet deployed, and political developments that would shape the war's progression. One particularly disturbing article described the death of every soldier on the base, providing specific dates, locations, and circumstances for casualties that wouldn't occur for months or years. Webb found himself reading his own detailed obituary scheduled for November 15, 2006, describing him as a retired colonel who would die peacefully in his sleep at Walter Reed Medical Center. The newspapers also began providing strategic intelligence about insurgent operations planned months in advance, describing weapon shipments, training camps, and leadership meetings with accuracy that could revolutionize American military operations in Iraq. But using the information created moral and strategic dilemmas that Webb struggled to resolve. If he prevented attacks described in the newspapers, would he save lives or inadvertently cause larger disasters? If he ignored the intelligence, could he justify allowing preventable casualties? Major Chen advocated for aggressive use of the newspaper intelligence to conduct preemptive operations against insurgent targets. "Colonel, we have information about enemy operations that could save hundreds of American lives and shorten the war significantly. We can't ignore intelligence this valuable just because we don't understand its source." But Captain Mitchell argued that using information from an unknown source could compromise operational security or play into enemy hands. "We don't know who or what is providing these newspapers. Using intelligence from an unverified source could be walking into a sophisticated trap." Webb decided to conduct a limited test by acting on intelligence from the newspapers to prevent a predicted attack on an American patrol. The newspapers had described an IED ambush scheduled for March 22nd that would kill 2 soldiers and wound 4 others. On March 21st, Webb ordered the patrol route changed and increased security in the area where the attack was supposed to occur. At the predicted time and location, explosive ordnance disposal teams found a sophisticated IED exactly where the newspaper had indicated, confirming the accuracy of the intelligence while preventing the casualties. But the next newspaper contained a disturbing response to Webb's intervention. The headline read, "Base Commander Alters Timeline, Creates Temporal Paradox." The story described how Webb's actions had prevented the predicted casualties, but created ripple effects that would result in different but equally tragic consequences later in the timeline. According to the newspaper, the two soldiers whose deaths Webb had prevented would later die in a helicopter crash that occurred because the pilot, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, would be reassigned to different duties as a result of the timeline change. Santos, a 31-year-old Black Hawk pilot from Texas with long brown hair tied back in regulation style, had originally been scheduled for leave during the period when the helicopter crash would occur. Webb realized that preventing one tragedy might simply cause different tragedies, creating an impossible situation where any action or inaction resulted in casualties. The newspapers seemed to be demonstrating that future events were interconnected in ways that made meaningful intervention extremely difficult. As the mysterious publications continued arriving, they began describing events beyond the immediate military situation. Stories appeared about political developments in Washington, family situations affecting individual soldiers, and global events that would influence the war's progression. One newspaper described a conversation that Webb would have with his wife during his next phone call home, including her exact words and emotional responses to topics they hadn't discussed yet. When Webb made the call, the conversation proceeded exactly as the newspaper had predicted, including his wife mentioning concerns about their daughter's college applications that she hadn't previously shared with him. The newspapers were somehow accessing information about events occurring thousands of miles away, involving people who had no connection to the military base or the war in Iraq. This suggested surveillance capabilities that encompassed not just the base, but potentially global intelligence gathering on a scale that seemed impossible. Chief Sullivan, whose intelligence background included exposure to classified surveillance programs, couldn't explain how any known technology could provide the comprehensive information appearing in the newspapers. "Colonel, I've worked with satellite reconnaissance, communication intercepts, and human intelligence networks. Nothing in our capabilities could generate the breadth and accuracy of information in these newspapers." The situation became more complicated when newspapers began appearing at other military bases throughout Iraq, each containing information specific to local operations and personnel. Reports from other commanders described identical phenomena, mysterious newspapers appearing overnight with accurate predictions about future events. Webb established communication with other base commanders experiencing the newspaper phenomenon. Colonel Jennifer Adams, commanding a base near Fallujah, reported that her newspapers contained different but equally accurate information about local operations and personnel. "The newspapers seem to be customized for each location," Adams reported during a secure conference call. "My papers focus on our operational area and our personnel, while containing general information about broader strategic developments." Webb realized they were dealing with a phenomenon that extended beyond his individual base, suggesting coordination or intelligence capabilities that spanned the entire theater of operations. This raised the possibility that the newspapers were part of a larger intelligence operation targeting American military operations throughout Iraq. But the personal nature of much of the information in the newspapers argued against conventional intelligence gathering. The papers contained intimate details about soldiers' family lives, childhood memories, and personal relationships that would be impossible to obtain through normal surveillance methods. As weeks passed, the newspapers began describing events scheduled years in the future, including detailed accounts of how the Iraq War would end, which soldiers would survive to return home, and what their post-war lives would look like. One particularly detailed story described Sergeant Rodriguez's wedding to a woman he hadn't met yet, providing her name, appearance, and background, along with the exact date and location of their future marriage ceremony. The story included quotes from wedding speeches that wouldn't be given for 3 years and descriptions of children who didn't yet exist. Rodriguez found the future wedding story both fascinating and disturbing. "Colonel, How can a newspaper describe my future wife when I don't even know who she is yet? And how can it quote wedding speeches from ceremonies that haven't happened? Webb had no answer for how the newspapers could contain such detailed information about events years in the future. The implications suggested that either human free will was an illusion and all future events were already determined, or the newspapers were somehow accessing information from multiple possible timelines. The moral weight of possessing detailed information about future casualties became overwhelming for Webb and his staff. The newspapers described the deaths of specific soldiers under his command, providing dates, locations, and circumstances with the same accuracy they had demonstrated for past predictions. Captain Mitchell struggled with the psychological impact of reading about the future deaths of soldiers she worked with daily. "Colonel, I know when and how Corporal Jackson is going to die, but I can't tell him because that might change the timeline in unpredictable ways. How do I work with someone every day while knowing their exact fate?" Webb faced the impossible burden of command amplified by supernatural knowledge. Military leadership required making decisions that risked soldiers' lives based on incomplete information, but the newspapers provided complete information that made the moral weight of every decision unbearable. The final newspaper that appeared at Forward Operating Base Phoenix was dated December 31st, 2030, 26 years in the future. It contained a retrospective article about the mysterious newspapers, describing them as temporal intelligence reports that had appeared at military bases throughout Iraq for exactly 90 days before stopping as suddenly as they had begun. According to this final newspaper, the source of the publications was never determined, but their impact on military operations and individual personnel had influenced the course of the war and the lives of thousands of soldiers. The article suggested that the newspapers had been part of an experiment or intervention by entities with capabilities beyond human understanding. The retrospective article included interviews with elderly veterans who had experienced the newspaper phenomenon, including an 85-year-old Marcus Webb, describing how the experience had shaped his understanding of fate, free will, and the responsibility of command. "We never learned who or what was sending us those newspapers," the elderly Webb was quoted as saying, "but they taught us that the future isn't fixed, that our choices matter, and that sometimes the greatest courage is accepting uncertainty rather than demanding impossible knowledge." On April 15th, 2004, exactly 90 days after the first newspaper had appeared, no publication was found at the usual location. The mysterious newspapers stopped arriving as suddenly as they had begun, leaving Webb and his personnel to continue their mission without the burden and advantage of knowing the future. Webb's final log entry about the newspaper phenomenon noted that while they had never identified the source or purpose of the publications, the experience had taught valuable lessons about leadership, decision-making, and the importance of focusing on present responsibilities rather than future uncertainties. "We spent 90 days knowing tomorrow's headlines, but we learned that today's actions matter more than tomorrow's predictions," Webb wrote. "The future remains unwritten, regardless of what any newspaper might say." Forward Operating Base. Phoenix completed its mission in Iraq without experiencing any of the catastrophic events described in the later newspapers. Whether this was because the predictions were prevented by Webb's actions or because the newspapers had never been accurate remains unknown. The mystery of the newspapers that predicted tomorrow continues to puzzle military historians and investigators who have studied the phenomenon. Official records acknowledge that unexplained intelligence reports appeared at multiple bases during 2004, but the source and mechanism were never determined. Some researchers suggest the newspapers were part of a sophisticated psychological operation designed to test military personnel's reactions to perfect intelligence. Others proposed that the phenomenon represented contact with entities possessing advanced technology or temporal manipulation capabilities. But for the soldiers who experienced the 90 days of tomorrow's news, the most important lesson was that knowing the future doesn't eliminate the need for courage, leadership, and making difficult decisions based on present circumstances rather than predicted outcomes. The base that existed tomorrow taught its personnel that the future, regardless of what any newspaper might predict, depends on the choices made today by people willing to accept responsibility for outcomes they cannot control but can still influence through their actions and decisions.